The dream of taking a four-wheel drive vehicle into places few have visited is a desire held by many. For those who do it, there are few more rewarding pastimes. For those who would like to do it, it holds many mysteries, the most obvious of which is 4x4 vehicle handling. So I welcome you and invite you to sit back as we learn some 4x4 driving skills. Before we drive anywhere, let's discuss four-wheel drive. When do we engage four-wheel drive? Let's start with the front hubs. Freewheel front hubs are there to save fuel. They serve no other purpose. So in order to engage four-wheel drive, we must lock them. But now the question is, when do we engage four-wheel drive? Let's talk about it. Let's keep this simple. Deciding on whether or not to engage four-wheel drive has got everything to do with safety. Ask yourself the question, does engaging four-wheel drive improve the safety of myself and my family in the vehicle? Let's say, for example, you're expecting the first rain of the season, or there's light drizzle. That's the time to engage the front hubs, preparing the vehicle so that you can engage four-wheel drive from inside the cab. Let's say, for example, you're on a long trip to a destination where you're going to do a bit of off-roading. When do you actually engage four-wheel drive? The moment you leave the tar road. You engage your front hubs and you leave them engaged for your entire holiday. You never have to get out again to lock them. You can make a decision immediately to lock four-wheel drive, to put it in four-wheel drive, just like that, without having to get out of the vehicle. You're on a dirt road. It looks like a good one. You know that you're going to be traveling at 90 or 100 kilometers an hour. Do you engage four-wheel drive? Absolutely. That's when you need it. You've spent a lot of money on your 4x4. Use the four-wheel drive. The four-wheel drive on a dirt road, a gravel road, you might not need it when going dead straight, but you will need it in an instant. If, for example, a truck comes in the opposite direction and threatens you and you have to swerve and you hit the curb on the end. If that happens and you're in four-wheel drive, you have complete control, gently accelerating out of the corner. You're in two-wheel drive, you're just like any other guy who's unlucky enough to be driving a two-wheel drive in a potentially dangerous situation. So lock four-wheel drive. It does not damage the transmission, it's what it's designed for. Traveling up to 100 kilometers an hour is absolutely safe. For those vehicles with so-called permanent four-wheel drive, what you need to do at that point is engage true four-wheel drive. You lock that center differential. Without the center differential locked, you are not in four-wheel drive. Don't be fooled by the expression permanent four-wheel drive. The additional tire wear and the additional wear on the transmission is so negligible, and the increase and improvement in safety is so significant, there really is no debate here. So many accidents that take place on a gravel road take place because of a sudden change in direction, an emergency, an animal, something appears in the way and there's now a sudden need to change direction. Now, we're at the skid pan Geratech, and this simulates exactly that. Traveling at about 70 to 80, maybe 90 kilometers an hour on a slippery dirt road, and we are going to simulate that change in direction. We're going to look at it in two-wheel drive, and then we're going to look at it in four-wheel drive. Well, if this doesn't convince you to engage four-wheel drive on a slippery surface or gravel road, I don't know what will. Now we're going to do the same thing in four-wheel drive, same speed. Alright, now I'm going to give it a go. I am not a stunt driver, but I'm going to do exactly what he did. Okay, second gear, 40 kilometers an hour, turn in, accelerate. Okay, that was good fun. Now, it's completely out of control at the end of that. Now let's try that in four-wheel drive. Okay. Turn. Fantastic. It doesn't need any correction after the second turn. So one more time. Just turns. It just turns around the corner. I don't have to force it to turn. Know about the vehicle you are driving, because every vehicle has its vulnerabilities. For example, a solid axle has its differential protruding, exposing it to danger. In this case, both front and back differentials align with the driver's left shoulder. Familiarize yourself with all low points of your vehicle. This includes the approach angle, where the vehicle body is exposed during steep slopes, and the departure angle, again exposed during steep slopes. In addition, the wheel's ability to articulate and grip on uneven surfaces will have an effect on driving technique. Make it a habit of passing high objects under the high parts, or ride the wheels over the high obstacles, clearing exposed components from harm. Let's look at one of the reasons for doing this. Passing a wheel too close to a high object threatens the most vulnerable part on all 4x4s, the tyre sidewall. Passing it safely over the obstacle may be more uncomfortable, but it's good off-road driving. The second most vulnerable part is the tyre tread, so avoid this. Selecting a path on a rutted track is not as obvious as it looks. A common fault is to follow the most obvious path. All a rut has to be is deeper than the minimum clearance, and the vehicle may bog. Reading clearances from the driver's seat takes experience, so begin by paying close attention to the path ahead. Pass the deepest ruts under the vehicle, and do not attempt to cross such a rut at less than 45 degrees. Doing so in slippery ground is likely to trap a vehicle. This Land Cruiser is now struggling on account of the driver having chosen the most obvious path. Notice the scar from the previous vehicle's differential between the tracks. The Defender driver here has been more cautious. Misjudging the vehicle's clearance can get you into trouble. Get into a habit of holding the steering wheel with your thumbs on the outside of the rim. It prevents a shock loading from hurting the fingers, particularly painful with older vehicles with non-power assisted steering. Changing gear in low range can be a jerky affair, especially when changing down a gear. Here I'm in low range second. I'm going to change into first because of an obstacle ahead. The way to do it smoothly: leave your foot on the accelerator when you depress the clutch. Smooth the silk, go through the obstacle as slow as possible. Simply allow your foot to rest on the accelerator as you depress the clutch. The revs increase, the gear goes in smoothly, release the clutch, you don't even feel it inside the vehicle. It's very smooth. The type of suspension fitted to a vehicle affects its performance over rough ground. What is seen here is typical of independent suspension. With it, ground clearance varies constantly. Notice how the clearance under the chassis, on the left of your screen, changes every time the suspension compensates for undulations. The other type of suspension, becoming less common as more vehicles are designed for better road performance at the expense of off-road performance, is the live or solid axle. Solid axles are an advantage off-road because they maintain the clearance no matter what the terrain. As the wheels ride over the ground, it lifts the differential, clearing vulnerable components from harm. This type of suspension also permits better axle articulation, better clearance, and better off-road performance. Here it is working on a dry riverbed. And here on the same riverbed is the independent suspension. The driving style with independent suspension must therefore be more cautious, particularly over rocky terrain. Looking more closely at how suspensions work in even more arduous terrain reveals how easy it is to damage a vehicle if driven too fast. One of the first principles we need to understand before we go off-road is the effect of tyre pressures on the terrain over which we drive and the vehicle's performance. Firstly, a tyre that is very, very hard will tend to penetrate through. A tyre that is soft will tend to float. Now, for sand driving, such as this morning, the sand is actually quite wet, so it's got a lot of buoyancy. The vehicle, even with fairly hard tyres, does not sink in. But the moment the sand gets soft, a hard tyre will penetrate through, making driving difficult. So the first question is, what surface are we driving over? And how will our tyres penetrate? If they're going to penetrate a lot and reduce the power pull, absorb the power from the vehicle, then we're going to need to lower our tyre pressures. Now, we're going to go sand driving today. And the first thing we're going to do is look at the condition of the sand, and here the sand in some places is quite compact, but where it's soft we're going to battle. So we're going to drop the tyre pressures. Our first port of call is 1 bar. We can go lower or we could go higher, but it's a good starting point. So I suggest that 1 bar is where we are going to start today. So to do that we need a tyre pressure gauge. Okay, it's the first thing you're going to buy at any off-road 4x4 shop. You're going to buy a tyre pressure gauge. It's the first thing you're going to need. .5. Okay, 1 bar, good starting point. Deflated tyres, while helping the vehicle float over sand or gain more traction because of its larger footprint, are now vulnerable. Too much power can turn the rim inside a tyre, which means that it will go flat, and its bulging sidewalls are vulnerable to damage by rocks and sticks. When you let down a tyre, it does this. Okay, when the tyre is flat, that's the surface area floating on the surface. When your tyre is at normal pressures, that's the amount. See the difference? Some people think it makes the tyre wider at the bottom. Trouble is, a radial tyre doesn't do that. It actually curves like this. You've still got that. But there's more to it than that. I want to talk now about tyre pressures on hard ground. Hard stony ground where the rocks and stones threaten the tyre sidewalls. Hard tyres over rocks will tend to bounce, and the tyre footprint is small. By reducing the pressure, as seen here, the tyres act as shock absorbers and the traction is improved. This also helps the tyres not slip off rock faces and expose themselves to damage. Corrugations, you better turn off the camera while I replace my teeth. Corrugations. One of the things you've got to put up with on trails. And it's getting really bad, so it's a little trick that just eases the pain just a little bit. Let the tyre pressures down a bit. My normal pressures here are 2.8 bar. I'm going to go down to 2.2 and do that with all the tyres. About 10 to 15% of the pressure. Let it out of the tyres. Okay, 2.3. It'll just soften the ride, and the vehicle won't dance around quite as much as it was doing before. I hate corrugations. I hate corrugations. There are miles of them, and they never end. Actually, it's made a bit of a difference. It's definitely made a difference. Definitely made a difference. Climbing hills successfully is a balancing act between traction and momentum. If the traction is good, momentum can be maintained easily and the choice of gears and driving style is wide open. But when traction diminishes, choices diminish with it. When traction is poor, there are three possible causes for momentum to be lost. These are: when a gear ratio that is too low is used, the high torque to the wheels causes wheel spin. This causes traction loss and finally momentum loss. When excessive speed is used, the wheels bounce over the rough surface, lose traction, and the vehicle slows. If a gear ratio is selected which is too high for the climb, the vehicle may stall. The secret of maintaining traction and momentum is first select the right gear to enable the vehicle to climb without stalling, but with a low margin of excess power. From here, delicate and well-timed use of the accelerator is used. This shows a gear ratio that is too low up an easy slope. The result: jumping, jolting and loss of momentum due to wheel spin. Up the same slope, low-range second gear demonstrates a smooth passage. This turbo diesel Discovery is in low-range second gear. One of the idiosyncrasies of turbocharged engines is that for power to be maintained, engine revs must not drop below the point where the turbo is working. This means that in many cases, turbo diesel vehicles must be driven in a gear ratio lower than would normally be the case. The most important element in climbing steep slopes is smooth power application. try this. Decide on the revs for the climb, set them and maintain them all the way up, keeping an eye on the rev counter and listening to the engine. When the revs drop, add a bit of power. As they increase, ease off the power. Do it smoothly or traction will be lost. On climbs where the wheels battle for grip, applying power at the wrong time can cause difficulties. Here, as the front wheel lifts and loses grip, the vehicle slows. The driver incorrectly applies more power. The correct method is to tap off at this point. Listen carefully to the engine revs and the timing of the application of power. Finding the best path on a slope is also important to successful hill climbs. Here the Colt tries the most obvious choice, the worn tracks on the right. On the second attempt, the flattest path, which looks steeper, works better because the wheels do not get caught in any ridges or holes. Steeper but flatter is the better choice. Likewise, the slightest side slope on a climb should be avoided. Here the Defender's good axle articulation works against it as the body leans and the two diagonally opposite wheels lose traction and spin out. To recover from this situation, the angle of approach must be flattened to equalize weight on left and right wheels. Now, what happens if we're driving along up these hills and we stall the motor? There's an easy and safe way of recovering the vehicle. I'll show it to you now, I'll demonstrate it. I'm going to stall this vehicle. Oh, that stalls. I put my foot on the foot brake. Most important thing to know, to remember, you never ever put your foot on the clutch at this time. That we're relying on our gears to slow the vehicle, to control the vehicle, to prevent wheel slip. We put our foot on the foot brake, not on the clutch. But we've got to get into reverse, so at some stage we've got to put our foot on the clutch. So, foot on the foot brake, nice and firmly. You can use your handbrake if you like. I'm not going to. It's an option. Vehicle is now secure. I'm now going to put my foot on the clutch, and I'm going to do it slowly and carefully to make sure the vehicle is safe on the brakes. I'm going to take it out of gear. I'm going to put it in reverse. Make sure it's in. Take your foot off the clutch, right off the clutch. Then I'm going to release the brakes. Now the vehicle will start backwards. And that noise is, of course, it now taking up on the transmission. The vehicle is now stationary. My foot is off the foot pedal. I'm going to crank the starter. I'm not going to with the starter. I'm just going to fire it, click it, just crank it over, because I do not want the starter motor to drive the vehicle backwards. I just want the vehicle literally to start under its own power. And it's just so safe and smooth. The secret is, do not touch the clutch while the vehicle is in motion. Only do that once you've secured it on the foot brake. Put it in gear, take your foot off the clutch, crack the starter motor, and the vehicle will come back under the gears, under compression, nice and safely, and you'll have steering control all the way to the bottom. The clip I'm going to show you now is a little extraordinary. Loose round rocks, and underneath it, loose sand. The Defender battled. We tried everything in the book. This is low second, just about flat out. Take a look. power we've driven up, let's go down. The slowest speed manageable with the minimum use of brakes is our goal when descending steep and slippery slopes. Relying on the gearing to slow the vehicle means that when the brakes are applied, they need only be applied lightly, ensuring that steering control is always maintained. I'd like to talk now about going down steep slopes. The beauty of a four-wheel drive is that all four wheels are being controlled by the transmission. So the primary tool we use for when going down really steep slopes is the transmission. The transmission slows us before we use the brakes. Let's go. Right, selecting the gear, the lowest gear possible. Low range, first. Foot off the clutch, foot off the brake. I'm relying 100% on the compression of the engine and the action of the four-wheel drive, which is slowing down all four wheels to slow the vehicle. I have control because the likelihood of locking a wheel, because I'm not touching the brakes, is low. Therefore, I'm going to have steering control all the way down the hill. So, transmission is the primary tool to slow a vehicle down a steep slope. And what happens is, sometimes it gets too steep and I've got to use brake. I use the brakes gently, feathering them. I do not put my foot on the clutch. I leave the engine, transmission working for me. And I feather the brakes. Be sensitive. If a front wheel locks because of heavy braking, you will lose steering control. If that happens, ease off on the brake immediately, regain steering control, continuing to feather the brakes. With the use of compression braking, steering control can be maintained on even the steepest slopes, such as this one that took so much effort to climb. Using brakes on a slope must be done carefully. Here are two examples of how not to do it. As the front left wheel falls into a hole, the brakes are applied, transferring weight forward. This exaggerates the fall and the vehicle tips forward. ABS systems do not work well in off-road conditions, and here's why. As the driver uses cadence braking to slow the vehicle, sand and stones are pushed in front of each wheel, which slows the vehicle. ABS works too fast for this to happen, and the wheels ride over the stones. Let's get extreme. When slopes are steep and rough, wheels leave the ground and cause the vehicle to slip and slide. Now watch closely and note the difference between the wrong way of doing it, the first attempt, and the second attempt done correctly. Here the driver controls the vehicle until all four wheels have grip before letting the vehicle roll down the slope. The action of open differentials on the axles of four-wheel drives means that when one wheel lifts, drive from that axle stops pushing the vehicle. When this happens to both front and back axles simultaneously, the vehicle stops. One remedy is more momentum, but this stresses the vehicle unnecessarily. The first technique is smooth power application by keeping the revs constant. When the twister becomes too much for the suspension to handle, then we progress to stage 2. Here we use the push-pull technique, a method of controlling wheel spin by timing the application of power. When a front wheel lifts and loses traction, power must be eased, as this wheel must not be spinning when it touches the ground again. The momentum needs to be just sufficient to carry the vehicle until this happens. During this time, the rear axle is pushing. As the front wheel touches the ground, power is then applied. At this point, the front axle, with both wheels firmly on the ground, pulls the vehicle through. But what if the twister is so deep that any momentum would damage the vehicle? Ditches such as this should be crossed at an angle so that one wheel at a time drops into the trough. In low range first gear, gently coax the one wheel to climb out as the next drops down. In extreme cases, wheels will spin. Use a gentle rocking motion and steer for best grip. Discovery Series 2. Interesting vehicle. It has traction control, it has hill descent control. Now these things mean that some of the traditional off-road driving techniques, we've got to throw them away. It doesn't mean to say that the vehicle is more difficult to drive. If anything, it's easier to drive. But I must say, for quite an experienced driver like me, it took some getting used to. We're going to demonstrate it now on this roller test rig, and we're going to look at it scientifically on how it works, and then we're going to take it off into the wild and see if it really works. First onto the ramp is the traction control equipped Discovery. The front right and both rear wheels are driven onto the rollers. In front of the only wheel with traction is an obstacle. With gentle acceleration, the wheel grips and the vehicle pulls forward. Now we're going to see the difference between a vehicle with a center differential lock and no axle differential locks. Not going to go anywhere. Let's try one with a rear differential lock. Open differentials on both axles means that the opposite wheels will spin, leaving the vehicle motionless. Locking the rear differential, and therefore the two rear wheels together, is not going to help because it is the front right wheel that must be driven to move the vehicle. Now things are going to get a little bit more difficult. Steep climb, we're going to start with the Discovery central differential locked. See how it works. Here the articulation is not sufficient to keep enough wheels on the ground. The result is that one front and one rear wheel spins out. With the rear differential locked, only one rear wheel needs to have traction to drive the Defender up the slope. With traction control, when a wheel spins, sensors act on the braking system, slowing it, thereby transferring power to wheels with more grip. The result is a system that needs no additional driver input. The system's downfall is that traction must be lost by a spinning wheel for drive to be transferred to other wheels. While the system is very sensitive to bad driving techniques, if it is driven well, it is effective in the most demanding terrain, and vehicles equipped with it can display outstanding off-road prowess. Traction control requires specific driving techniques in almost all spheres of operation. Perhaps the most significant difference between the driving techniques of an ordinary four-wheel drive and this vehicle with traction control is that when you go down a steep slope, you must use your brakes. Yes, you use the lowest gear possible. We're in low range and we've locked it into first. Of course, we engage hill descent control even though we might not need it, because we are going to maintain the vehicle under its kick-in speed of 7 kilometers an hour. Other than that, it's being sensitive on the brake, and when it slides, ease off very slightly and let the gears take over. If you don't use brakes, because of a lack of a center differential, the vehicle can run away with you, and it can do it quite alarmingly. That's why you must put on your hill descent control, because it'll act as a parachute. If you do make a mistake, you take your foot off. By the time this vehicle reaches 5 to 7 kilometers an hour, it will engage and will slow you down. There you go. It actually feels very safe. It's an unfamiliar way of driving, but nevertheless it works. Before going up the slope, a word of warning. If you lose traction halfway up a steep slope, whatever you do, do not release the accelerator. Apply the brake first. Okay, now quite a challenging slope, and the technique is the same as we've learnt earlier on this vehicle. Give it just a little bit of momentum, and if it falters, you leave your foot on the accelerator. Okay, what has happened there is the vehicle has slid sideways. I've applied my foot on the brake before taking my foot off the accelerator. That's a very, very important thing to do. If you take your foot off the accelerator, traction control thinks, oh, I'm no longer needed. It lets go the brakes and the vehicle will slide backwards. I'm going to correct my position. I've slid. I have not put it in reverse. If you find that sliding backwards you lose steering control, use your handbrake as well, but gently on this vehicle, otherwise you could damage the transmission because it's a transmission brake. Okay? Okay, I made it up the hill. It wasn't terribly satisfactory or particularly satisfying, because in harsh conditions like this, it's true that the vehicle does chew up the ground a bit, spin the wheels, but nevertheless, very capable off-road.
Another technique we must master is the new technique of maintaining a constant accelerator even when traction is lost. With regular four-wheel drive systems, the accelerator is eased when the wheel spins. Do this with traction control and the vehicle will stop. Let's now compare the traditional with the new. With traction control, ease the accelerator when traction is lost, and with a conventional system, apply the accelerator when traction is needed, and now traction control with the correct technique. And conventional four-wheel drive with the correct technique. Two totally contrary driving techniques for two different vehicles. This demonstrates the right and wrong technique for traction control. A gentle approach and then accelerating at a difficult section tends to cause wheel spin before traction is regained. With a little more momentum and a constant accelerator, the vehicle sails through. Here a jerky accelerator brings the vehicle to a halt over the easiest of obstacles. Again here, smooth power application does the trick. But when things get really difficult, maintaining good momentum and a constant accelerator sees the system working at its best. Similarly, with Jeep's QuadraDrive, smooth power application and enough momentum for the system to engage works best. An alternative to traction control, and one which requires traditional driving techniques to be used, is differential locks. The most common is a rear diff lock, which prevents wheel spin across a rear axle. Care must be taken with the use of axle differential locks. Lock them, as seen here, while the wheels are spinning, and damage could result. Stop and wait until there is no drive to the wheels before engaging it. Here is a typical situation where a rear diff lock is a great help. The vehicle is hung up, front and a rear wheel clawing at thin air. Most modern diff locks are operated electrically. With 100% drive to both rear wheels, the vehicle cruises through the obstacle. Diff locks allow the vehicle to pass over terrain that would otherwise require far more skill. And when you add a front diff lock to a rear diff lock, things get interesting.
Now with older technology, like in this vehicle, we have differential locks, traditional differential locks. This is one of the few vehicles with both front and back. Climb like this, I'm only going to pull up the back. Okay, in this vehicle it's hydraulics, not a little switch, so you definitely know it's up. Let's try it. Okay, now I have to lock my front differential. Now, the trouble is with locking a front differential is that steering control is seriously impaired. Now, let's see if we can get up this obstacle now with front and rear differentials locked. Now this is interesting because I couldn't turn. Front differential is locked, it's now disengaged, so it'll allow me to turn. Back one is not disengaged yet, but it will disengage any minute. That's the disadvantage with old technology. The beauty of it is, of course, it's simple. There are no electronics to go wrong. It's very, very simple. Great for expedition use. But to tell you the truth, the new technologies are outstanding. They really are brilliant, and they do this job without the difficulty of knowing when to engage it and when to disengage it, which you need a certain amount of skill to pick up.
When driving side slopes, two important factors must be remembered. The first is momentum. Momentum gives directional control, so drive smoothly, power on all of the time. The second is the effect of steering. Steering is the most important element in driving side slopes. What often happens is this: steering up the slope and accelerating. Now the effect of the steering is demonstrated here. Here, steering against the slope increases the angle and makes traction difficult. So straighten the wheels momentarily and traction is regained. Here again, the same principle is applied. By making the turn as late as possible, decreases the angle and the chance of wheel spin on a slope. On slippery ground, side slopes can be very hazardous. Here the drivers are too slow to react. They should steer in the direction of the slide to maintain steering control. For one brief moment, they lose control. For the novice, mud can be one of the most challenging obstacles. For the seasoned off-roader, one of the most rewarding. One way of doing it is this. Or you could do it the proper way. Smooth, constant application of power. Try keeping the accelerator movement to a minimum. This decreases the chance of wheel spin, and steer on the path of least resistance. Let's see what happens with a jerky accelerator. Balancing momentum with control is important. Too much momentum can mean loss of control. Too little can mean bogging down. More experienced drivers may use a different technique to maintain momentum. When the vehicle slows because of traction loss, decelerate. The traction is regained and the speed increases. Then apply light accelerator to maintain the speed. Steer during the deceleration phase. In thick, cloying mud, the technique of rocking a vehicle works particularly well. In this situation, the mud was so thick that we were unable to turn the vehicle round. So we went back up the slope in reverse. One of the terrains that I enjoy the most is a mountain pass in slippery mud. Here we were on our way to visit family, taking a long cut through some hilly terrain. We've been enjoying some mountain driving in beautiful inclement weather in the highlands of the Free State, and we've come a little bit unstuck. Lost concentration I've slipped into the drainage culvert at the side of the road. This is a very, very common way of getting stuck when mountain driving in slippery clay. Now, I don't have a difficulty, I can get out of this quite easily, but down below me it gets quite difficult. Secret behind driving in conditions like this. Very slippery mountain conditions. There's clay, it's thin, and at the side of the road we have these drainage ditches. You put two wheels in a drainage ditch and you'll stay here for the afternoon. The vehicle will slide. You correct the slide by turning into it and accelerate. And as the vehicle starts moving forward, you center the steering and hopefully you'll stay clear of the ditch.
driving on this stuff is so much fun. Treat snow as you would a very, very slippery mountain road until the point where you can no longer see the gravel or the road underneath the snow. Because what actually happens is the snow starts getting compacted by each vehicle that goes over, and you get a layer of ice, and you want to float on that. At that point, start thinking of it as sand. You've got to drop your tire pressures as much as 50%.
There are various regimes of sand driving, all commonplace on most expeditions. There is beach driving, sand tracks and dunes, but of these, sand tracks is the most common challenge to adventurers. Steering feedback is weak on any kind of sandy surface, and it is when driving on long stretches of sand track in semi-desert regions that driver fatigue sets in because of the lack of directional feel. What first-timers often do is fight the steering wheel.
The trick of driving on a sand track is to hold the steering wheel very, very loosely. I'm going to give you a demonstration now. There's a nice corner ahead, and look what happens to the steering wheel. I'm hardly touching it, okay, and I coax it where I want it to go, and basically I'm following the sand track perfectly, not having to do any work at all. Now, this is the wrong way of doing it. We're going to go back and do that same corner again, and I'll show you the wrong way of doing it. Here we are again, wrong way of doing it. The curve goes this way. I'm actually going to turn in the opposite direction. Okay, watch what happens. I'm turning in the opposite direction, we're still going along the road. Now if you look at that from the outside of the vehicle, it's amazing how little feel you get through the steering wheel, and that's why novice drivers often do it. They fight the steering wheel, but that's because they can't feel which way their wheel's pointing.
Like mud, steering is more effective when the accelerator is eased. Under power, there is massive understeer. Decelerate before the corner and accelerate out of it. Deep sand tracks can become like a railway track, trapping the vehicle. In cases like this, steering can become quite a challenge.
Here we are in central Botswana, driving along sand tracks. As we've already discovered, the front wheels don't do a hell of a lot for our steering in such a track, and that we can turn the steering wheel as much as we like, and often nothing happens. Sometimes in a situation like this, we'll want to get off the sand track. Use of the steering wheel alone, we've already discovered, doesn't really work. There is, however, a trick. I'm going to demonstrate it now. Let's pretend we've got a vehicle coming towards us and we need to get off the sand track. Okay, the sand track is fairly thick, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem if I do this. Hold the steering wheel in the center, okay? And I'm going to jerk the steering wheel around and center it. If it doesn't come off the track, I'm going to center it. If it does come off the track, I'm going to center it. Watch this. And I'm off the track. We're going to go and try that again. Watch again. Driving along, jerk the steering wheel around and center it. You see how smoothly it comes off? We've already learnt that if I turn the steering wheel slowly, the front wheels will drag. Then perhaps they'll suddenly get traction and the vehicle will shoot sideways. By doing this motion and straighten again, the vehicle comes off very gently. Very, very important to center it no matter what happens. If it's very, very heavy sand, the moment you swing the wheel around, take your foot off the accelerator, which induces oversteer in a four-wheel drive vehicle. You'll only need to do that if we're not going to do it now, the sand here isn't thick enough. You only need to do that if the sand is really thick. You try it again and again and again, remembering to center each time. Swing it over and center. Swing it over and center. Eventually it'll come out of the track.
The action of brakes in thick sand is also interesting. It piles a wall of sand in front of each wheel, and in doing so brings the vehicle to a halt so rapidly that it can be dangerous. Use your brakes gently in sand. Should this happen, reverse a short distance before taking off. Dune driving presents all of what we have learnt about sand, but adds steep gradients. With dunes, it's all about timing of the accelerator and judging the momentum needed to reach the top, which is slow enough to stop at the top, with the vehicle pointing downward. Power on a bend and you'll bog down. Too much power at the wrong time and you'll stop. Get it right and it looks very easy. Go too fast and something will break. Descending very steep dunes should be done in low-range second gear. First gear is too slow and the sand flowing down the dune moves faster than the vehicle. This must be prevented, as should it occur the vehicle will slide and control can be lost.
In sand tracks, automatic gearboxes, if it gets very difficult, steep climbs, very soft stuff, very sharp curves, don't just put it in drive. Drive will take care of most of it. But when you have a situation where the gearbox is changing, gears are changing too much, changing the wrong time, click it down to second and stop the gearbox from changing the wrong time. Interesting thing about driving in sand dunes and sand roads like this, question of whether you lock the rear differential. Well, generally speaking, no, because it affects your steering, and steering is obviously difficult in situations like this. But I'm going to tell you something, it helps a lot in most of this. So, lock it if you think that there's a lot of axle twist happening. Leave it unlocked if the corners are very, very tight. If you find that it's been locked all day and you're battling over one particular obstacle, try it. Unlock it, try it, lock it, try it.
On dunes and tracks, vehicles can get trapped when the vehicle fails to make a climb. A short run-up and a steep hill requiring momentum can pose a challenge. One way around this is to go back and build a flat, smooth run-up by gently rolling back and forward 2 or 3 times over the run-up area. This compacts the sand and builds a run-up area where the speed can be built up before the climb.
Go back, carry on, make a flat area.
When pulling off, it is important to do so gently to avoid all wheel spin. Rocking in sand, if it's dry, digs the vehicle in deeper. But if the sand is wet, it can have a very different effect. Beach driving is like dune driving but requires many more precautions. There are some practices which experienced beach drivers use to keep themselves out of trouble as well as look after the environment. First, they straddle other vehicles' tracks, always below the high water mark. By doing this, driving is in undisturbed, smooth sand. In this position, it's also easy to read the surface from the disturbance made by the vehicle in front of you. On many beaches, tide action create cusps. These are sand ridges running perpendicular to the shore. Keep speed moderated as you hit one of these at speed and a vehicle can become airborne. and they're often difficult to see. Many drivers use low gears in high range, which is bad driving practice on a beach. Much better is high gear ratios in the low range. In low range, a rapid change down into a lower gear is possible and can mean the difference between getting caught out by a soft patch, which otherwise would trap the vehicle. Always drive on an outgoing tide, and never ever drive on an unknown beach at night. Those who do invariably lose their vehicles in the tide. There is no question that automatic transmission is superior to manual transmissions in many spheres of off-road driving. But again, driving techniques must change. One of the most challenging terrains to drive with an automatic transmission is uneven ground where the vehicle must be crawled. The tendency for automatic transmission is to surge, and this must be dealt with.
Approaching the obstacle at the wrong angle, so it's another consideration. In a situation like this, keep the wheels perpendicular to the obstacle. One of the secrets of smooth driving with an automatic transmission is left foot braking. In other words, the torque converter is working all the time. You have power to the wheels all the time, and you can control the amount of power you want to go to the wheels by applying the brakes. Watch this. Okay, I'm holding it on the foot brake. Apply power and release the foot brake, and up she goes.
I said it would help. I didn't say it was foolproof.
Worried. Okie dokie. All I need is one large rock and our problems are over. And if I can get that axle to get traction both sides, hopefully it's going to pull that other wheel over that other pole.
But what happens when a hill climb is failed? Ordinarily, reverse gear is selected and the vehicle runs awkwardly backwards. A much safer way to do this is to engage drive and ease the brake. When the vehicle runs backwards too fast, apply light accelerator. Do remember that this practice stresses the gearbox, so be gentle and avoid doing it aggressively. Once that is done, select a new path and give the hill another go. is an automatic gearbox with front and rear differentials locked, clogged tyres on a very slippery surface. Driving down steep slopes is one of the few places where a manual gearbox is superior, but the principles are the same. Engage the lowest gear and use a combination of gears and brakes. Although low-range first gear is engaged, because of an automatic gearbox's tendency to overrun, engine braking is not the primary tool used for slowing the vehicle. Here, use the brakes, but their use must be regulated. Should a wheel lock, the brakes must be eased to allow the wheels to rotate, so that steering control is maintained. Practice smooth and gentle use of the brakes. Engage hill descent control if you have it, and try and keep the speed as constant as possible. On this descent, left foot braking was also needed. The left foot on the brake permitted the right foot to accelerate the vehicle over each pole. Constant brake pressure arrested the vehicle's urge to run down the hill too fast.
In a beautiful part of Namibia, and we're about to tackle the infamous Van Zyls Pass in northern Kyrgyzstan. And we're going to do it with an automatic transmission vehicle, and we're going to find out a little bit more about how to take them down steep slopes. Never been here before. This should be quite interesting. Okay, we're going to go into low range. I've heard it's particularly steep, and it is into low. Automatic transmission, lowest gear, and this one I have a brake function which I've now engaged. And brake off, and we let it go. Now, one of the things about automatic transmission is they tend to race. The idea of automatic transmission is that you take your foot off the brake and you let it get to speed. You let it settle on the speed that it will run on the transmission. Then you apply brake. If you apply brake once it's running, it will tend to surge more. Just a few things to think about. Engage your air conditioning system only if it is the type that does not have a compensator and increase the engine revs. If it does not do that, it will actually absorb power from the engine and increase your engine braking. Do that with both manual and automatic transmissions. When you look at your line, aim for it and stick with it. Decide where you're going to put your front wheel and don't let things change. If you know where your front wheels are, remember your back wheels will follow if your steering wheel is straight. Aha! Oh, look here. This is now going to get very interesting. Now, this is what I thought it would look like. This is definitely brake on, very slow approach, because one slip and one can take out a diff or gearbox. Just a word on differential locks when going down steep hills. Don't lock your back. Differential tends to induce oversteer, so keep them unlocked. Well, we made it. We're at the top of Funsails Pass at the lookout point. I've waited a long time to get here. I've looked forward to getting here for a long time. In front of us is the Murray and Fluss. We're in northern Coquerland, and what an astonishing place. Well, finally made it at the bottom of Funsails Pass, and like all worthy travellers, select a rock and put it on the traveller's pile. Phew! What a wonderful trail.
One of the most impressive examples of the effectiveness of automatic transmission is when driving on sand. The same rules of sand driving apply, but because auto transmissions can change down a gear in an instant, excessive use of power can bring a vehicle to a halt very quickly. This shows a typical over-energetic method of driving on sand where too much power creates handling difficulties. When too much power is applied on the corner, understeer results. Delay giving power until the vehicle is turned. More vehicles are damaged driving in water than in any other terrain. So you can do it this way. Or you can do it the proper safe way. So the question is,
How deep can you wade in your four-wheel drive? I'll show you a very easy way of finding out. All you need is a tape measure. About a 3-meter one is fine. And the vehicle manufacturer's handbook. And you look on this, you find the maximum wading depth. And then you take your tape measure and you throw it away. That's how deep you go. Remember, vehicle's got electronics. It doesn't matter if you've got a snorkel this high. It's not going to change things. You've got electronics often underneath the seat. You've got axle breathers, gearbox breathers. So take your vehicle into water at your own risk. But if you do, and you have a problem, and you ingest water, this is what to do. Take out the spark plugs and the glow plugs. Jack up the back wheel and disengage the center differential. Rotate the wheel by hand. By doing that, in 4th gear, rotate the engine. There's no stress, you can feel it. The water will come out. Once you've cleaned that out, clean out the air filter, the turbo, etc. Put it all back together again. It's a nice, safe way.
checking the depth by foot is the first thing you do when confronted by deep water. Take a long stick to steady yourself, because in most cases you will not be able to see what you're walking on. Be sure that the depth will not exceed that recommended by your vehicle manufacturer, and take into consideration the firmness of the riverbed, the speed at which the current is flowing, and undulations. All these can increase the depth dramatically. Slowly, gently ease into the water. The entry speed, even in shallow water, must be kept down. Momentum can only be gained after a bow wave has been created in front of the vehicle. This is what most drivers do. They rush in, and huge amounts of energy is absorbed as the vehicle pushes a great weight of water in front of it. The splash not only robs momentum, but the turbulence can damage a vehicle, and wet electrics can stall a petrol engine. Riverbeds are another terrain demanding special techniques and offer a workout for both drivers and crew, made easier when the bed is dry. Most riverbeds are driven in low-range first or second gear because the most common obstacles are hard, unyielding rocks. Low speed, maintaining perfect control is required. High water currents leave large stones on which to drive. Slower currents leave banks of silt, often soft and waterlogged. Notice where there are stones, the tyres sink little. But where there are few stones, deep silt collects. When the water is flowing, vehicles get damaged if driven anything above the slowest crawl. In a silted riverbed, the only way to determine gear selection and speed is to walk it first. This is first gear low ratio, with momentum gained before hitting the deep, soft silt.
Flat riverbed. Safe? Well, maybe not. It's nice and hard. Would you drive on this? Look, let's see. Little bit of an indentation. Oh, look what's happening there. Oh dear. Now, I did a little test a minute ago. To my horror, found this. This is treacherous, bottomless stuff, and the amazing thing about it is that it looks hard, but it isn't. Now if you look at the lie of the land, you'll see here there's actually a trough. Now close to the rocks it'll be slightly harder. In the middle of the trough is where water will remain for a while and silt gathers, and it's these areas that are particularly dangerous. If you're going to cross a riverbed, cross it at 90 degrees across the stone. Don't try and run along next to the river, because that is where the silt gathers, and that is this kind of stuff. This is unbelievable. Look at this stuff. And I was about to drive through this.
On a rocky riverbed, building bridges and ramps is often necessary. Let's watch as the experts do it.
One of the delights of bush travel. Here we are in central Namibia on a rutted track, trying to find our way to our camp for the night. Just a tip on this kind of driving through heavy bush, thorn bush, is that if you want to wind down the window, don't take it all the way down, and especially don't put your elbow out, because thorns can poke your eye out, and that'll really grab your attention. The best place to do it is about there. It prevents any danger to your eyes, and it's safe and still gives you a fresh breeze.
Pulling trailers is not very different from normal off-road driving when it comes to technique, but when it comes to the vehicle's ability, it can be severely taxed. There are, however, some important points to consider. The track of the vehicle's rear wheels is similar but not the same as that of the trailer. The longer the drawbar, the more the trailer will tend to cut corners. Steep descents need to be taken with extra care. Make sure that no part of the trailer will strike the vehicle at these extreme angles. Listen closely and watch where the wheels are when the power is applied. The front wheels have started the climb, but the rear wheels are on level ground, enabling optimum traction at the point of the application of power. The additional drag and lower speeds, especially in mud and sand, mean that a lower gear ratio is often advised for most obstacles. This is why rear axle diff locks are particularly helpful when pulling trailers over ground where anything but the slowest crawl threatens to damage the trailer.
We are in the notorious Makati salt pans, one of my favorite places on earth. Driving on the pans is really rewarding. It's also quite dangerous. The reason for the danger is this. Underneath this seemingly safe surface is thick, black, cloying mud. So bad that once your vehicle is trapped, you really have to do a hell of a lot of work to get out. The secret of pan driving is never to cross the middle of a pan. Never be tempted to take that shortcut. The reason for it is simple. Along the edges of the pan, next to the tussock grass, the surface has had time to dry out. Away from the edges, where the water was deeper during the rainy season, obviously the water has taken longer to dry out. Now what happens is the surface becomes almost a waterproof layer, preventing further evaporation. So you get a crust on top which looks firm, but just underneath it is this terrible mud. The secret is to stay near the edge. Two basic reasons why: it's drier, and secondly, if you get bogged down, you can get an anchor from another vehicle close by. He doesn't have to drive through the same soft stuff and risk getting stuck. Let's go and take a drive. Second gear high range is the gear of choice. Don't be too tempted to go into third. I can easily drive on this section in third. I'm staying in second. I'm keeping the revs up. If I start to sink, I've got the power.
You put your foot down. If you start to sink on these pans, you floor it. Get as much power as you can. Obviously, if you get a lot of wheel spin, you can ease off a bit, but keep the vehicle moving. That's number one objective if you start hitting soft stuff. Some important advice when driving on pans. This scar tissue here on the surface is created by turning the steering wheel too hard. If the vehicle had been traveling straight, we wouldn't have broken through. That little bit of steering breaks through. Rule number one, never ever play pancakes on a salt pan. The vehicle will roll. This happens to the outside wheels only, and before you know it, your vehicle's on its side. Another good reason for sticking to the edge of the pan. They're so beautiful. Don't crisscross them with scars. Leave them as they are. Keep to the edge, look after them. So that those that follow you enjoy them as much as you do. We've just been filming how to not get stuck, or how to avoid getting stuck on the pans. Come and look at this. Follow me, Jacques. Oh, I must introduce you to Jacques. Give me the camera. Yeah. This is Jacques. He's helping me get stuck. Come here, look at this. This is the kind of mud you get into. We got stuck out there. We decided, let's give it a go. Let's go to Caconia Island. 3.5 k's across there. We're on our own. Surface is fine. So we give it a go, following all the rules I've just displayed to you. And it gets a little bit wet, but we keep going. And it gets a bit wetter, about 1.5 k's across. It's pretty wet, but we're still floating. About 2 k's across, we start sinking. About 3 k's across, we just by the skin of our teeth manage to get onto some tussock grass. As we get onto it, I think, oh, gee, thank the Lord, we made it. Guess what? In the mud. I didn't film it. It is so hot out here, in fact, I think we should quit filming, it's too hot. Don't take the risk. 2 vehicles. Don't do what we just did. We got out, it took us about 1.5 hours because I've been in this situation before. I know the tricks, I know what not to do. Be careful about digging. When you dig, you disturb the soil and the vehicle sinks deeper. You've got to find logs and pack them underneath the vehicle. Balloon jacks don't work. You've got to have a high lift jack to get the vehicle up. Experience, I suppose, but don't take the pans lightly. They kill people. Sunglasses, hats, sunblock. If you do get caught out here, have a hell of a lot of water in the vehicle. And don't. Danger. On the way around these pans, there's lots of grass. You get it packed in your radiator, and when you're starting across this pan, you're using every bit of power that motor has to get across. You overheat so rapidly. We had a bit of grass in the radiator, and we cleaned out the radiator. Between there and here, the thing went straight into the red line, and that's with a clean radiator. That's how hard vehicles work when they're driving across pans. Let's get out of here. Cut.
What a day. What a drive. Oh, well. Cheers.
Salute.
What we need now is a good trails book to read.
To find out exactly how lost we are.
Look, we're being watched.
Again.
Look, see those people watching television over there?
You're not supposed to notice them.
No, look at them. There's a whole bunch of them.
It's a whole
They're standing
breeding
in
colony.
there, and they're sitting on chairs looking at the screen. Hmm? Get a rock. That'll go.
You hit him.
Look. There he is there.